Yes, first of all, many, many thanks to Dr. Valerie Steele and the whole team at the Museum of FIT for this very generous invitation and wonderful opportunity to gather with so many scholars that at first stimulated actually my own research and interest in this field of fashion in museums. And you have asked me to talk about fashion and dress museology, two terms initially introduced in the edited book Fashion and Museums, published by Bloomsbury, in order to organize and understand the developments around the entrance of fashion into mainly art and social history museums since the 20th century. The concepts helped to describe what was going on, particularly in the early 21st century, when the presence of fashion in museums seemed to explode, and which has been really highlighted here today already. And this is not only happening in great international metropolitan museums, but also at museums on the periphery. Indeed, even in a small country like Denmark, where I come from, which has a relative short history of being a fashion-producing country. So the focus of my talk today is a report from Denmark, and then it is an explanation of the concept of fashion museology and dress museology. And finally, an attempt to locate fashion museology in the wider context of museology and in the current critical discussion among museum scholars about the purpose and relevance of museums. Oops, sorry. There we go. So let me begin this talk by inviting you to Denmark, to the capital city of Copenhagen, and to the thriving museum landscape. The number of reported museum visitors has been increasing year after year, mainly due to the growing number of tourists visiting the Happy Danes and seeking a taste of our prize-winning new Nordic food culture. Here, one could claim that fashion museology thrives, from art museums to social history museums to natural history museums. There is a significant engagement with the topic of fashion, understood as suggested by fashion business historian Regina Blatzig and Véronique Polliard as a cultural and economic activity. That is both a way of dressing and as an industry that produces and distributes fashionable clothing. The topic of fashion is believed to have the potential to strengthen a museum's communication and its visibility as a continuing knowledge institution in an age of strong competition from other cultural attractions for the attention of the media-savvy visitors. At the National Museum of Denmark, the nation's preeminent social history museum, the exhibit Meet the Vikings, obviously, which forms part of the permanent display of Danish prehistory, has developed its communicative scope through fashion imagery. In the exhibit, the Viking Age, which is commonly considered a vital part of the Danish national identity narrative, is displayed through archaeological findings, explanatory text panels, and full-size fashion photographs, illustrating the presumed looks of Vikings living in the Scandinavian region between the year 700 and 1050 CE. Danish fashion designer and amateur Viking reenactor Jim Lingvild made the Viking dresses and styled the images in collaboration with two experts from the museum's archaeological team. Fashion is being used in the exhibition as an interpretive tool to draw attention to the museum's prehistory displays through the use of 14 fashion photographs and 5 wax mannequins. Furthermore, in the choosing of Jim Lyngvild as fashion designer curator, the museums called additional attention to the display, since he is a controversial persona, known for his nationalistic statements that align the Vikings with the idea of a special Danish DNA. Lyngvild's hiring arouses objections from many critics. They made public expressions of opposition, so what so what they called the unlimited interpretation. Lyngvild applied to the styling of the photographs in order to convey his message, mixing jewelry from around 800 CE with other accessories from the Middle Ages, as well as contemporary imitation Viking Age accessories. In other words, he turned to the anything goes practice common to the creation of fashion magazine images in order to establish his desired visual narrative. In the exhibit Meet the Vikings, fashion demonstrates its multifunctional ability to provoke, make news, and guide interpretation in the wonderland between fact and fiction. But to the defense of the museum, it's very explicit about the question of what is fact and what is fiction, as the first exhibition text asks the visitor very directly to reflect upon this when encountering Viking fashion imageries. The second case I would like to highlight how another museum has offered fashion a front stage role, but with a different ambition and approach. This time it is the Natural History Museum of Denmark that has invited fashion into the museum through the upcoming special exhibition Fashioned from Nature, bought from London Victoria and Albert Museum and set to open April 13, 2019. The choice to buy this special exhibition and to invest in fashion and its interconnectedness with nature is very conscious. The Natural History Museum of Denmark is currently in its midst of a major transformation. In 2023, a new large-scale museum exhibition building will open, located between the Copenhagen Botanical Gardens and the existing Geological Museum. The special exhibition will be on display in rooms that will be in the future will be integrated part of the future museum site, alongside its historic jewel, the original systematic displays of the museum's mineral collection. With this prestigious new museum project, the museum is keenly aware of the need to build a new target audience that include both younger visitors between the age of 18 and 30 and women 30 years and older, who are expected to make up the majority of visitors when the new museum opens. Furthermore, the museum is aware of the need to communicate its mission, to disseminate knowledge regarding the interdependence between people and nature. Fashion is again given a front stage role by the museum, in this case to serve the long-term goal of museum brand building, visitors development and mission dissemination. However, the case also demonstrates how in recent years fashion has drawn attention to what would typically be perceived as the backstage business of museums, producing special exhibitions for further profitable circulation. The third case and last case I would like to highlight is that of Design Museum Denmark. At this museum, the semi-permanent display Fashion and Fabric demonstrated the museum's transformation beginning in 2011 from a self-declared traditional museum of decorative arts to a modern design museum, understanding design in the widest sense to encompass objects, processes, and mindsets. Parts of this transformation included a strategic focus on fashion as a primary perspective, providing a new way to communicate the existing collection and research focus on dress and textile. This represented the first time in the history of the museum since 1890 that fashion was officially sanctioned as a core interest of the museum. Fashion was hereby highlighted not only in the museum communication, but also through its public research library, once it had recognized its open shelf of dress and fashion and textile books under the category of fashion. It was able to assert its status as the largest fashion library in the country. Furthermore, the collection, previously called Dress and Textile, changed its name to Fashion and Textile. And in due course, the collecting policy was revised in order to emphasize its particular focus on Danish fashion design from the 20th century and onwards. Finally, the semi-permanent display, Fashion and Fabric, featuring highlights from the collection, was added to the museum's public exhibition program in 2014, representing fashion history, fashion as craft, and fashion as identity practice. The latter theme represented a significant departure from previous exhibition themes of dress and highlighted the understanding of fashion as also a cultural activity in people's lives, not just a design object. The museum's invitation to fashion was even further developed in 2016 with the opening of a major permanent temporary Danish design exhibition, Danish Design Now, covering Danish design since the year 2000. The exhibition expanded the perception of design and gave contemporary Danish fashion a prominent place in the narrative of the importance of design in improving everyday life, both in proposing sustainability solution as well as in the perception of Denmark as a design nation. Fashion has, in other words, played a vital role in making the museum in all its activities front stage oriented and strategically focused on what interests visitors and make the museum relevant to them. What connects these current events in Copenhagen museums then is the practice of fashion museology. Fashion is utilized as a welcome strategy in all three scenarios. Fashion is not only a museum exhibition topic, fashion is, in the case of Design Museum Denmark, integrated into the transformation of the modern educational museum into a hyper-modern, visitor-oriented and communicative cultural attraction. Fashion is, in the case of the National Museum of Denmark, used as a tool to draw the attention of the visitors towards permanent displays of Danish prehistory, hoping to make the visitor critically reflect upon what is knowledge and myth, and what is fact and fiction in our way of encountering cultural heritage as a past-presencing act. Finally, at the Natural History Museum of Denmark, fashion is invited to revitalize the museum, highlight its core values and mission, and reach a new target audience as part of its branding strategy in advance of its opening of the new large-scale Natural History Museum in 2023. So, to understand the musealization of fashion and the transformation processes of museums' practices as catalyzed by fashion in recent years, I have suggested the usefulness of introducing not only the concept of fashion museology, but also dress museology, to understand how museums, particularly those with a long history of collecting, researching, and displaying dress, its history and its wear, are transformed when fashion is made a strategic focus that goes beyond fashion as an object. Fashion museology emphasizes the visibility not only of fashion exhibits, but of the entire museum as a collection of practices. Fashion museology is a front stage practice that connects the museum's traditional front stage and backstage operation with visitors, stakeholders, media, and society as a whole. The logic driving fashion museology is a recognition of the purpose of the museum, to be relevant to the people they serve. Though fashion museology has much in common with the concept of new museology, it also stands in contrast to the new museology program, since it is shaped by capitalist logics of supply and demand and of news production, and as such leans on the impulses streaming out of the so-called experience economy. In comparison to fashion museology, dress museology pertains to the actual practice of collecting dress to research into dress objects and to the exhibition of dress objects in a way that highlights knowledge about the objects. As such, as such, dress museology is more closely linked to old museology, if one could say so, to believe in the truth value of the object itself and the cultural authority of the museum. Dress museology could be said to be the modern disciplinary museum's way of musealizing fashion. Indeed, the practice of dress and fashion museology are most often entangled in museums, as the transition from the one to the other requires major changes in museum practices and in basic perception of the purpose of the museum, as the case of Design Museum Denmark could be said to demonstrate. Having said this, I believe it is beneficial to separate the two concepts on a theoretical level, since they can help analyze the current fashion hype in museums and understand the changes that museums undergo when they encounter fashion and make fashion part of how they perceive their purpose and reach their visitors. So, before concluding, I would like to elaborate on how we can understand the presence of fashion in museums by understanding this as a process of fashioning museums. One might argue, after all, that this tendency is just another symptomatic celebration of the new. In cultural institutions dedicated to the preservation and reflection of cultural heritage, such as the museum, the theme of fashion seems to clear away the cobwebs and make the museum inviting, dynamic, and attractive, as I've already indicated a few times in this talk. In short, fashion feeds the transformation of the museum from a classical shrine to a post-museum, to quote museum scholar Eline Huber Greenhill. To those who study museums, this is reminiscent of the ideological movement in critical museum studies known as New Museology, a program for reflective museology, a critical approach to museum practices, and a constant focus on the museum's democratic duty via education to interact with and continuously promote diversity and inclusion among its visitors. As stated above, however, fashion museology is driven by a capitalist ideology and can, in this context, be linked to what has been termed the new museum ethos by museum scholar Kylie Message. The oft-cited example of the new museum is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, which opened in 1997 as part of the city's transformation from industrial depression to supposed post-industrial cool. The new museum constitutes a new physical institution defined not by the category of objects in its collection, but rather by its image of newness. As Message states, quote, "Seek to blur disciplinary boundaries and promote interpretation according to a wide and inclusive scope of reference. The image of the newness refers to the style of architecture, the approaches towards installation, and the modes of publicity circulating around the museum rather than to what is exhibited. While the term new refers thus to a particular style of museum that has emerged recently, it also, and more importantly, indicates a desire for museums to appear relevant and appealing to a contemporary society," end of quote. In other words, the new museum could be understood as a fashioned museum, styled by a star architect and subject to strategic branding in order to rejuvenate a place. Fashion museology repurposes the museum, as does new museology, as stated above. Fashion museology does not necessarily foster museums' critical potential, however, nor does it in and of itself transform museums into forums for the kind of debate required and sustained and building democratic societies. This points to a dilemma regarding fashion in museum. On the one hand, fashion offers both new and old museums the prospect of appearing relevant, attracting broader media attention and generating greater visitor numbers with wider demographic variety. On the other hand, it is fair to ask questions like, does fashion in museums have relevance beyond the entertainment value of enjoying a fashion designer's creativity and the beauty expressed through clothing and body adornment? Or how does fashion in museums contribute to fashion and dress research at universities and other kinds of research institutions? New museology's goal of reflecting the multivocality of our cultural heritage is yet unfulfilled by museum fashion exhibition, except in good cases you have already seen today, but not all cases. Even the more politically motivated fashion and sustainability exhibitions often fail to make a conspicuous effort to critically question the fashion industry, opting instead for a diplomatic approach that emphasizes a narrative of design and technology solutions. The current V&A exhibition, Fashion from Nature, for example, underplays the impact of our fashion consumption on the natural environment in an elegant and aesthetic way, instead of including upfront brutal images showing the consequences of textile industry pollution and waste from the overconsumption of fashionable clothing. But as I see it, and as I have tried to argue, fashion in museums is not in opposition to the goals of new museology. It is an alternative, a fashion museology, driven by what the Swedish ethnologist Orvar Löfgren has called the catwalk economy. In this way, fashion museology throws light on what I would call a new museology controversy. Some museums have adopted the ideological visions called for by museum scholars since the 1970s by acknowledging in their work the politics of representation and actively seeking to share power with the communities they serve. But other museums, once enacting a fashion museology, seem first of all to embrace the power of the new, producing new events and visitors' experiences designed to be enthusiastically consumed. Of course, if their efforts prove successful, they have additional means and resources to invest in their scholarship. As the 3 Danish case studies of fashion museology suggest, the push to make museums trendy or fashionable should not become an objective in its own right. Museums' trends are not imperatives, but possibilities. 5 years after the introduction of the concept of fashion museology, I believe that the ambition of future fashion museology must remain a constant sharpening of its critical edge, particularly in the practice of fashion curatorship, as the immediate point of contact where the museum meets its visitors. This is not so much to assimilate the new museology program, which has to some extent provoked an unproductive identity crisis in the museum institution, but rather to strengthen what I believe is still the museum's core purpose, to produce and communicate state-of-the-art knowledge for the benefit of the general public, so that their museum visit experience can help them to become critically reflective, and in the case of fashion, to understand and learn, for example, how to read a fashion image, to see what impact fashion has on people's daily lives, to perceive the role of the fashion industry and fashion design, etc. Because the topic of fashion, as we all here probably know, engages non-traditional museum goers. It can be used by the museum as a lens through which our past and present may be told and explored in a much more nuanced way. Increasing research in fashion through the academic discipline of fashion studies promotes such development, and the growing number of educated fashion curators are helping to materialize these visions in innovative exhibition designs. But it is not an easy task to transform and steer up conventional forms of practices, as actually also Julia's book shows us. The challenge is to develop the critical scope characteristic of genuine research. Only then can museums and cultural institutions continue to change so that the knowledge institutions they can continue to endure. I think that was it. Thank you.